"She's just old and bitter," my son said to his wife when I asked to join dinner. I laughed, then bought the company he worked for. HR delivered the news 2 days later. I thought I had weathered the sting of words before, years of criticism, quiet neglect, polite disregard, but nothing prepared me for how deeply a few simple sentences could resonate, like a bell toll marking the end of something I thought was unbreakable. "May I join dinner?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though the breath felt borrowed from a stranger. I stood at the threshold of their modern living room, a place I had once called home, but whose contours had become foreign. Light dripped from uncaring fixtures, illuminating furniture chosen for visual effect, not memories. I asked quietly, because I believed in ordinary courtesies, the tacit assumptions of family that I thought we shared. My son looked at me briefly, cold, detached, his mouth curved with the precision of a scalpel's edge as he spoke. "She's just a leftover. Old, bitter, and useless. Why drag her to dinner?" The words floated between us, absurdly calm in their cruelty. It was not the words alone that cut me, it was how I realized I meant nothing to them now. The bonds I had spent decades weaving were dismissed in a single breath. I froze. My chest constricted with memory. The early years, when my arms held him after school, repairing scraped knees with buttercups and bandages, soothing tears with lullabies I feared I'd already forgotten. I felt each memory unravel, as if the floor beneath me was dissolving. Time had made those memories fragile, and now those same memories lay crushed beneath the weight of indifference. My daughter-in-law turned, her face serene and controlled, as though she were posing for a portrait. Her hand lifted in a smooth arc, guiding me toward the hall, as if escorting an unwanted art installation to a storage room. Her voice drifted behind me, polite and cold as porcelain. "Our new life doesn't have room for relics." Her words remained after I left. I crossed the threshold, every step echoing with the absence of invitation. I entered the hallway, which smelled faintly of cologne and expensive candles, fragrant veils that masked the truth. I passed photographs of vacations, promotions, meticulously curated smiles. The house was theirs now, a showcase of a future from which I'd been edited out. I trembled when I stepped outside into the evening air. The street lamp flared by my car, revealing the shadows that had traced me here. I drove home in silent tears, my headlights illuminating emptiness ahead. The world outside continued, people planning their nights, cars passing, dog walkers under yellow halos. But I felt deflated, like someone had stormed into my life and taken the windows with them. I climbed the narrow stairs to my room above the garage, a space that belonged more to me now than anywhere else. The door clicked behind me, sealing me in solitude. There was no laughter there, no filtered conversation, just the hum of the night and the low whistle of a tired ceiling fan. I sat on the edge of the bed, the cheap fabric of the pillow cutting into my wrist. My heart pounded in rhythm with memories. Lessons I taught, dinners we shared, nights of whispered advice under a soft lamp glow. In this room, I held on to the fragile notion that I once mattered. Then I heard him, my grandson's voice, brittle and carefree in its cruelty. "Grandma snores like a broken vacuum. Are we even sure she's awake?" I stiffened. That voice had tumbled upstairs into my refuge. Hearing it left me feeling stripped of dignity once more. I clenched my teeth, furious that even the youngest saw me as something to mock. I stood and walked to the window. Moonlight flooded in, cold and steady. Outside, the neighborhood lay serene under a quilt of quiet shadows. The driveway was empty. For a moment, I envied the dark for its embrace. Then I leaned on the sill, feeling the chill of the glass on my fingers. I remembered night drives with my husband when we talked about dreams, planting gardens, long after our children had grown. I remembered hiding scraps of poems in lunchboxes, trying and failing to share with him my fragile desires to write a legacy. And I remembered sending him off at the hospital with promises to sit by his side, telling him I would. I inhaled, steadying myself. A shudder rolled through me, but I did not cry. Not yet. Silence broke me in pieces, but also steeled me, because they said I was useless. They tried to make me vanish, but here in the quiet, with only the moon as witness, I felt something old awaken. A fierce, throbbing pulse that said, I was here. I still am. I opened the drawer beside the bed and found a pen, a brittle thing, but still mine. I pulled a page from the small notebook there, one I had used to write down homework assignments once. I held it with trembling fingers and caught myself thinking that I was not ready to vanish. I wrote a single line, trembling. I will not apologize for existing. I closed the notebook. I closed my eyes. The next moment I was not shaken. I was still. And when the night ended, I lay awake, with eyes open, listening to silence that no longer frightened me. The air was still in my lungs, but my heart roared with something fierce. That I had survived, and that was enough. I once believed in the quiet power of legacy, that the footprints of kindness, of small sacrifices, would leave impressions that time could not erase. I spent decades teaching social science at a well-respected university, publishing studies on family values, community cohesion, and generational empathy. I didn't choose to become known. It happened because my research spoke to policymakers, to community leaders, to students who were searching for meaning. In my office, lined with books and student thank you notes, I felt at home. Back then, I believed that knowledge cultivated compassion. I believed that giving your best meant raising someone who would reflect your finest ideals into the world. That was why, when my son wanted to go to college, I sold the small apartment I had inherited from my parents, my own haven, my quiet place, and used every penny to fund his education. I thought, giving my son that opportunity would let me see him flourish in ways I never could have predicted. I remember the day of his graduation. I dressed carefully, my hair freshly styled, my dress modest and neat. I waited in the aisle of the auditorium, palms sweaty, heart loud. When he accepted his diploma and spotted me, a warm smile lit up his face. I thought he would smile and wave at me with pride. But as soon as he saw me, he turned his head slightly and whispered under his breath, loud enough for the graduates behind him to hear, "That was 20 years ago, Mom. I've moved beyond that pity project. But I know the truth isn't dated." His words hit me like an unexpected blow. I felt the ground shift beneath me. In that moment, something fragile inside me cracked. The love that had propelled me to make that sacrifice felt used, like a label, pity project, to diminish me, to diminish what I had given. Not long ago, those sacrifices had made me worthy of admiration. Now they were dust on the timeline of his success, something embarrassing to be shoved aside. Later that evening, I was in bed with a high fever, pneumonia the doctors said might complicate. I asked my daughter-in-law for warm broth. She looked me up and down with mild disdain and said, crisp and controlling, "Stop dressing plainly. People expect bright energy, not hospice gray." She meant no malice, only the priority of image over substance. But those words cut deeper than any accusation. She dismissed me as someone who belonged in faded hues, someone whose presence would disturb the aesthetic she had so carefully curated. So even when cold and fighting for breath, I rose, went into the bathroom, changed, forced a slight splash of lipstick, and left the clothes I preferred, soft gray cardigans, worn elbow patches, folded neatly in the basket. They were part of my identity, part of the story of who I had been, but in their eyes I was outdated, superfluous. I lay back in bed, staring at the ceiling, every bone aching. But deeper than physical pain was the ache of absence, the ache of having been erased from their narrative, the mother who believed in him, the professor who inspired hundreds, the late-night comforter who nursed him through teenage heartbreaks. That version of me was no longer welcome. As the days passed, I watched them post pictures of glamorous dinners, beachfront getaways, achievement awards. I watched them laugh without me, celebrate without me, and I realized they were rewriting the story without acknowledging me, that I was a missing archive, presumed empty, when really, I was full of history that had built them. I began to write again. Not academic papers, but memoir fragments, handwritten scraps in a small notepad I kept hidden under the mattress. I wrote, "They have forgotten everything I built. They remember the outcomes, but not the sacrifice. They hold my love like a credit line used up and disposed of." It pained me to record these truths, but I knew a story left unwritten is easy to rewrite. So I held fault in my pen, not resentment, and I wrote. A sense of bitterness took hold, but it was not bitterness toward them. It was bitterness toward the fiddle I had played undetected while they danced. I resented deeply the injustice of being taken for granted, praised when convenient, dismissed when inconvenient. In the mirror, I could see traces of the tireless professor, the mother who raised him, the woman who wrote about human dignity and social cohesion. But that woman had become invisible. In their world, natural law had shifted. Gratitude had no place for aging bodies or for love that had already given everything. And yet, that memory of who I had been would not go quietly. I saved newspaper clippings, photos of me at conferences, local civic awards I had received, liner notes from colleagues who dedicated scholarships in my honor. They reminded me that I had once been celebrated, not for vanity, but for dedication, for integrity, for giving someone better than I had ever expected to become. As the winter wind rattled the window panes, I looked at those relics of my past, and I felt a fire stroke in my chest, not of vengeance, but of sense. I realized that I still mattered, that everything they had forgotten was not gone. It lived in the margins, in old lives lived fully, and one day I would write those margins into the main story, regardless of whether they were listening. In the quiet nights that followed, I began drafting letters, not sent but carefully composed, to grant committees, to old students, to community leaders, trustees. I began reshaping my narrative, gathering the threads of my relevance. I was no longer the Pittity Project. I was the foundation they thought they could outgrow but never truly outgrow. By the time I tucked the notepad away and watched the moonlight soften the room, I had buried the bitterness under resolve. I was not angry exactly. I was awakening. I thought I could sleep through the memory of indifference. I thought that fatigue would morph into relief, that the ache behind each rib would soften like old brine washed away by time. But night never erased their words. At 2:17 a.m., when the house was hushed and the weekend outside felt distant, I was jolted awake by a familiar voice, my son's voice, tight and matter-of-fact, carrying through the hallway wall, clearly audible in my small room above the garage. "We should just stage a grandma can't make it funeral dinner," he said, calm and practical, as though discussing a meeting he'd rather skip than a human being he regarded as insignificant. My heart hitched, my breath stalled. That phrase, funeral dinner, was cold as a tomb, dragging my dignity down into the dirt. I lay completely still, trying to process how the person I raised could reduce me, his own mother, to a rumor, a whispered afterthought, a grief to be simulated rather than felt. The next voice crackled with laughter, light, dismissive, precise. "Call it closure. Everyone can forget we had her." His wife, my daughter-in-law, spoke with laughter thin as glass. The words cut sharper than admission because they meant she was not merely unwanted, she was unwanted on record. They wanted the erasure of her existence to look tidy, even compassionate to others. I felt the walls close around me, the darkness, his accomplice. I did not cry. I cannot explain why. Perhaps because tears are for loss, and I was not yet certain I had lost her, or perhaps because crying would have been a confession of vulnerability in the face of open betrayal. I could still feel the dull pulse of rage in my fingertips, as if blood had turned to lava and absently colored my veins. I reached slowly for the brass reading lamp beside the bed, but paused. I wanted to keep vigil, not in sleep, but in witness. An idea rose. I needed to record this crime of the heart. I hoped someday my presence might matter enough that someone in the world would hear it. I folded back the covers and rose, the floorboards sighing under my weight. I bent over, tracing the path down the hall, toward that wall where their words had sounded like sinister hymns. The house was too silent and felt too small, but I did not turn invisible. I did not let fear shrink me. With trembling fingers, I retrieved a notebook from the drawer, one I'd carried since graduation, plain, soft cover, pages blank and promising. I held it open on my lap, pen poised. I let the silence sit. Inside it, those words echoed, funeral dinner, forget we had her. I braced my pen and wrote them down, every syllable. I wrote in short bursts, letting the pen burn the insult into ink. We should just stage a grandma can't make it funeral dinner, call it closure. Everyone can forget we had her. When I read it back, the words looked foreign on the page but familiar in their sting. I paused, fingers hovering over the paper. The room was dim, The moonlight cast a silver wash across the pages, illuminating the truth I had recorded. The same moon that had watched over me the night before, granting me resolve, now shone on this testament. I wrote another line, small, steady, resolute. They do not know I am hearing them, and they will learn what happens when I remain. Fingers numb, I closed the notebook. I felt a groundedness latch into me. I folded the page, placed the pen beside it, and lightly touched the cover, as if it were a second skin. In that moment I stood, the moonlight brightening the edge of my silhouette. I shivered, not from cold, but from momentum. I was no longer going to shrink into silence. I was present. I was not going to vanish simply because it served their convenience. I did not speak. I simply walked to the window and threw it open, letting the night breathe into the room. The cool air whispered secrets of distant lives, of people who ran toward tomorrow, of streetlights trembling on the asphalt, of cars passing unannounced. Then I turned the world inward. The power of existence does not just reside in being seen, it lives in being willing to stand, even when the world pretends not to notice. The moon held witness. I felt the endurance of my own heartbeat. I backed away, closed the window gently, and lay down again, not with resignation, but with clarity. I did not yet know how I would act, but I was poised, not angry, just luminous in my determination. Morning would come, but for now, I lay with my eyes open, not as memory, but as force, unyielding, unashamed, awake. The next morning, sunlight dripped through my curtains with an innocent promise, brushing against everything in the room that had held my grief and perseverance. I sat on the edge of the bed, tracing the worn quilt with trembling fingers, still feeling the pulse of last night's awakening. The rage had simmered into resolve, but without direction, until I found it. Next to the framed portrait of my husband, silver-haired, kind eyes, the memory of his voice always in my ear, was a battered envelope I had never noticed before. Its edges were thin, the paper creased to the point of translucency. I froze. The handwriting was unfamiliar. I unfolded the envelope with the gentleness one gives sacred paper. Inside was a flash drive taped to the paper, and folded underneath, a note in his handwriting, unmistakable, steady. If I go before you, I want you to have words. I want you to be heard. Tears pooled at the corners of my eyes for the first time in a long time, but they were part of clarity, not grief. I lifted the USB as though it were the only thing that mattered in the room. It clicked softly in my hand, small and lifeless, until I remembered the power it held. I plugged the drive into my computer, the old one I had repaired once with his help, and watched the files appear. There were two. One, an audio file labeled Voices of Disregard, my son's voice replaying last night's words. She's just a leftover, old, bitter, and useless. Why drag her to dinner? Another voice, smooth and cold. Our new life doesn't have room for relics. The third voice, lighter, but no less cutting. My grandson. Grandma snoring like a broken vacuum. Are we even sure she's alive? I swallowed hard. The recordings were unfiltered, raw. These voices, I knew. These insults were recorded evidence of my erasure by those I'd raised. 2. A second file labeled Final_Guide. My husband's voice, grainy but warm, filled the empty room. You raised him with your sacrifices. If I die first, I trust you to remember, not for pity but for dignity. You don't deserve to be erased. You deserve to be heard. Pain, tender aching, honest, knotted in my chest. I replayed the recording over and over, as if to memorize its cadence. I clenched my jaw. This was the thread I had waited for. I gathered each file, each note, each memory. I saved them in 3 locations: my laptop, a flash drive hidden, and an email draft addressed to the local newspaper editor with the subject, "To the editor, this is the truth I held in silence." Then I typed in the body. Dear editor, I am writing anonymously because I fear the consequences of my truth, but I cannot remain invisible. Please hold this. Audio recording of words that reduced my life to discards. A video message from a man I loved, my husband, asking me to speak when I could no longer be silenced. I do not demand vengeance. I demand memory. Sincerely, a witness. I attached the files and hit send. I closed my eyes and rested my head against the cool wood of the desk. Outside, the day carried on. Children laughed, traffic hummed, surgeons operated. Normal, perpetual, oblivious. 2 hours later, I found an alert. Story published. My hands trembled as I opened the link. The headline torched the morning. Texas widow uncovers private recordings, family accused of ageism and betrayal. The article led with my husband's message. You don't deserve to be erased. It replayed my son's cruel words like evidence. The tone was reverent. Journalism lifting a quiet heartbreak into public awareness. Within minutes, the comment section flooded. Disgusting treatment of a woman who devoted her life. That son's success is built on cruelty. She was silenced. Now we will listen. On social media, hashtags trended. Listen to elders. Respect not relics. My cell phone, silent for months, lit up with messages of support. Calls, texts, emails. Former colleagues expressed sorrow for how I had been treated. Former students sent love and condolences. A few said, I owe every lesson to your belief in me. Away from the screen, the world felt different. Something that had felt erased just yesterday was now seen, both by strangers and by me. That evening, my son posted an apology on his public page. I hurt the person who loved me most. I was cruel and ashamed. I am sorry. Below, supportive comments poured in, some gentle, some frustrated, but none denying my presence. For the first time, people believed I existed. I watched the video through tears, not of weakness, but of relief. Because the world had shifted. Not because I yelled, not because I demanded it. I simply shared what he said, and the truth carried weight. I sank into my armchair and turned the flash drive over in my hand. The moonlight touched it through the window. I placed it gently in a box with letters he had given me. I would keep it, not for more battles, but as a quiet testament. The night found me not as someone erased, but someone acknowledged. Tomorrow, I thought, I would stand taller. No celebrations, just breath, presence, because the recordings did not need me to scream. They just needed me to remain, and I would. I spent the night turning over every syllable of the recordings, feeling my husband's words alongside mine, quiet, stubborn, insistent. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. Over the years, I had accumulated a small nest egg, savings meant to keep me safe, independent, if nothing else. My husband and I planned modestly, my retirement, a modest will, a small reserve for emergencies. Nobody questioned it. I was just the elder, destined to fade into memory. But that small sum became the instrument of change. I researched quietly. I found that my son's company, one he claimed he had built with his own ingenuity, was a subsidiary, controlled by a holding company. That holding company had publicly traded shares, accessible to investors with sufficient capital. I approached a discreet financial advisor the way one might consult an old friend, and within days had quietly steered enough funds to secure a controlling interest. I became the majority shareholder. Legally, quietly, ruthlessly. The morning of the internal company meeting, I stepped into the polished conference room. The boardroom smelled of new upholstery and stale ambition. Executives murmured in surprise, whispers curling. My son's face turned pale as he recognized the woman taking the head chair. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. My presence was the shadow that shattered his certainty. I stood, deliberately composed. Silence draped the room. My gaze moved slowly over each face. Managers, investors, yes men. I said simply, you may call me what you will. A relic, a leftover, bitter. I know who I am. But let me tell you this. In the world I know, value is not declared, it is recognized by others. And today, many of you must recognize me. A stunned hush followed. Then I dropped my second announcement. I was instituting a new department, respect and inclusion for senior colleagues, and I made it a company policy. Any form of ridicule, insult, or dismissal based on age or silence about it would be a reportable offense. Repeated offenses would trigger mandatory training and, in severe cases, disciplinary review. Heads shot up. My son's color drained further. I finished with quiet certainty. No one gets to decide that my age devalues my person. But this company, from this moment, recognizes that wisdom earned over decades has greater worth than the facade of perfection. I turned. I left. I walked down the corridor with each echo of my heels feeling like reclamation. Later that day I received a notification. My son had been reassigned, demoted. From executive to structural analyst, an invisible role with little impact or future. It wasn't vindictive. It was justice by design. That evening, I sat in my small kitchen, replaying the twist of grief turned into agency. I realized I was not punishing him with blame. I was showing the quiet strength that enables change. My phone lit up with texts, some with lingering love, others with embarrassment. My daughter-in-law didn't reply. I prepared a modest dinner for myself. No celebration, no triumph, just the calm of someone who had stood up and been seen. And the weight of the words I heard last night, the ones spoken in betrayal, fell away. They did not vanish. But I was no longer defined by them. I sat back and closed my eyes. My hands were steady, my heart light, because today I was recognized not for what I used to be, but for what I had become in silence. I sat in the office with the windows open, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor, shadows that stretched toward me as if to tether me to a past I had outgrown. My phone buzzed sharply. I picked it up and saw a live stream notification already trending. My son's face filled the screen, disheveled, red-eyed, raw. "My mom wrecked my career," he yelled into the camera. "She came in, used my money to buy the company, and now I'm demoted, humiliated." The words hurt in a way I did not expect. Not because they were false, they were more than false. They were a crude projection. He was trying to shift responsibility for his own cruelty. He had offered me betrayal in childhood and adulthood. But the world did not approve of such misplaced blame. As the comments started piling in, I read them with measured breath. Actually, she showed you had none. Ageism doesn't build legacy, it buries dignity. My grandmother would be proud of her. Respect isn't given, you must preserve it. Within hours, headlines followed. Ageist son demoted after harassing elderly mother appeared in local papers. The tone was not celebratory, it was coldly objective, drawing lines between harassment and consequence. Meanwhile, the backlash spread outward. My daughter-in-law, who had stood by and encouraged the humiliation, started receiving messages from clients. Her accounts began to dry up. A few even announced they'd withdraw business. She resigned. No celebratory tone, just a slow realization that cruelty has costs. My grandson, my sweet boy, sent me messages from school. He was fine with the technology, but not with what kids were saying. "The other kids are calling me Grandma's project, but not in a good way," he said. I read about how he had shrunk in classrooms, 2 boys taunting him at lunchtime. "Your grandma wrecked you, didn't she?" That broke something inside me. Not the ache again, but the sorrow of collateral loss. I went to his school the next day and spoke with the teacher. "He didn't do anything wrong," I told her. "But hurt has echoes. He needs to know this was not his fault." She nodded and promised to manage the classroom. At home, I cooked simple soup. The steam curled from the bowl. I heard my grandson playing quietly on his tablet nearby. I arranged the bowls and stood still a moment, steady in the kitchen I had once used to nurture him. I carried mine to the table. I turned to him and said softly, "You know, success isn't something someone hands you. It's something you keep with grace, by honor." He looked up. "No one can take that from you unless you let them." I realized something simple. Achievements are blessings, not entitlements. When you build them on disrespect or prejudice, they crumble, not outwardly, but where you stand. My son lost more than position. He lost credibility. And his pain was his own doing. That evening, the house felt quiet but not empty. I carried the warmth from the kitchen into my notebook, writing, "Success is not a gift you can reclaim once it slips through your own hands. And age is not a flaw, it is the imprint of every lesson survived." I closed the book, ready for whatever came next. The night was still, and I allowed myself to feel not just relief, but relief made from vindication, not from anger, but from quiet affirmation that dignity, once earned, is not erased by ignorance. That was enough for tonight. I woke today not to the silence I feared, but to a resonance I had never expected. The world outside had shifted, not because I demanded a stage, but because I stood steady, and people began to see. I decided to formalize what I had already begun, a simple foundation, not flashy. The Legacy and Dignity Fund. Our mission: preserve and honor working people beyond age 60 who contribute despite prejudice, provide micro-scholarships for adult education, and offer legal aid to those facing ageism. I secured the initial funding from the company's revenue and my personal stake, not as a spectacle but as an anchor. We launched quietly, with a small ceremony in the boardroom, not a gala. A few employees, myself in the front row, some community leaders. The press knew of me now, so reporters filtered in, but the heart of it was in the people. The elderly mechanic gathering for free training, the single mother of 40 picking up bookkeeping classes, the immigrant seamstress offered legal support. The headline across national media read, "Widowed Texas Grandma Turns Ageism into Corporate Legacy." I winced at the attention, but a surge of something warm filled me. Recognition had arrived without hubbub. Social media reacted with empathy, validation, sometimes outrage, for the way my family had treated me once. But I didn't gloat. I just gave voice to the dignity that had gone unseen. Meanwhile, my son, whose public apology was fading, was invited to lead a community campaign called Respect Your Elders. Boy Scouts, high school assemblies, church gatherings, he showed up at local schools and recounted what happened, choking on every name he spoke. My mother, the woman I disrespected, I am sorry. Sometimes he broke down. I did not ask for it, but watching him step onto stages to face consequences with humility was more than I had hoped. My daughter-in-law, shamed by public reactions, ceased contact. I suppose validating her brand had cost her conscience. My grandson, awkward and shy, now attends school without mockers. The children who once taunted him now avoid his eyes. He wears his grandma's quiet pride like a shield. I visited him this afternoon at his school. He showed me his report card. Only B's and C's, but a note from his teacher. He's settled. I see less fear in his eyes. I pinched his cheek and said, "You taught everyone more than I did." In the evening, I sat on the porch looking at the sky turning pink. My notebook was open, with phrases forming. Justice is not revenge. It is the restoration of humanity. I closed it and exhaled. I had no need to broadcast more. My dignity, once discarded, had become what people lift. I had not sought fame, I had only held still. The day closed with neighbors coming by, one who used to volunteer with me years ago, now frail but grateful, whispering, "You gave us promise again." I clasped her hand and said, "Promise is always two ways." In my chest, I carried quiet satisfaction. No triumphal music, no heralds, just the surety that living in truth mattered more than being right, because in a world that tried to erase me, I showed them the power of remembrance. I used to think that power roars, that it demands attention through noise, spectacle, clamor. But day after day, living through the aftermath of last month's chaos, I've come to know something far quieter, something more luminous. Real power whispers. It does not seize, it settles. I woke early this morning, before the edges of the sky turned blue. I walked to my desk and opened my journal, its paper soft and sure beneath my fingers. The final page bore a line I'd written last night, half lost in insomnia, half found in peace. Power is quiet. Legacy isn't inherited by blood, it is honored by how you remain when they try to erase you. That line felt right, like a signature that belonged, not just to me, but to everyone ever overlooked. I closed the notebook and placed it gently beside a small brass lamp, whose light I had barely needed these days. I realized then that I had no words left to make, but a world still needed witness, and so I rose, stepping softly across the worn oak floors toward the back window. Outside, the Texas sky began its slow transformation, pink with possibility, gold with patience. No fanfare, no music, just light quietly shifting from dim to dawn. The sky held me with its softness, its promise that darkness doesn't last, but it also lacks urgency. Dawn simply arrives. I settled into my chair, pulling a shawl around my shoulders, My hands rested in my lap. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the cool breeze and gentle colors wash over me. A memory floated through me. My husband, one hand holding mine, pointing east at sunrise as he whispered, "Every day is an invitation." I had forgotten what he meant until now. At that moment, I did not feel old. I did not feel weak. I felt presence in new form, quiet, steady, resolute. For a while, I simply sat there, breathing with the rhythm of something beyond pain or story. I was still here. I had outlasted everything meant to erase me. The world behind me had shifted. My son had learned humility. My daughter-in-law vanished in contrition or fear. My grandson regained his innocence. But this moment was not about them. It was about me and the dignity I had reclaimed. Quiet conviction softens the ground beneath the feet of injustice. I felt it in every breath. After the sun fully rose, painting the landscape in promise, I returned to my journal. I wrote one more line. I want to be remembered not for what I fought, but for who I did not let go, even when I could. I closed it, feeling whole. I turned and looked at the room, one that once felt like a refuge from being rendered invisible, but now felt like a home sustained by memory, by quiet endurance. I understood that victory isn't always fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it is the calm that comes when you reclaim the ground stolen from you, not with a yell, but with the certainty of being. I stood, stretched, and moved toward the day, no fanfare, no announcements, but with dignity carried gently forward. Because real strength lives in how you remain, and sometimes the quietest presence echoes the longest. I have learned that some endings are not marked by closure, but by continuation, not by ceremony, but by permanence. And so as dawn settles past the horizon, I return to the window, not to confront the world anymore, but to greet it. This morning, the sun rinses everything with gold. The dusty fence posts, the sagging porch pillars, the old oak leaning against the sky. From here, I count the same houses I used to think of as empty of meaning. Now they seem full of memories. I hold my journal close. Its cover bears fingerprints from nights of unspoken belief, nights where pen scratched against paper to whisper, "I exist." Today I open it to the final empty page. I think about writing more, but pause, because the story isn't mine to keep writing alone anymore. It lives in the people whose lives have brushed mine, the mechanic learning new skills, the refugee mother finally enrolled in college, the kid at school who no longer fears being invisible. I stand and step onto the porch. The boards, creaking softly beneath my feet, seem glad to have a purpose again. The swing beside me holds a cushion I placed for quiet mornings like this. Nothing dramatic, just a place to sit and remember. A neighbor's car passes, the driver tips their hat. A small gesture, but in it I recognize gratitude. Not loud, but remembered. I think of my grandson. He comes out to the porch, slippers slapping softly. He brings his sketchbook and sits beside me. He shows me a drawing, 2 stick figures, one old, one young, holding hands above the words, "She stays." I feel something slow and strong bloom in my chest. I don't need to praise him, he already knows. Later I walk quietly through the garden, roses half open, thirsty for sun. I touch a dusty petal and imagine how each bloom took time, not flash, just growing. I kneel and press my palm into the soil. It feels warm, alive, rooted. I retreat inside and bring the framed photo of my husband from the mantel. I cradle it gently and place it by the kitchen window. Sunlight holds his face. I smile. I may have been erased once, but never by him. At lunchtime, someone knocks. It's the local reporter from the morning headlines. He's come to ask for a follow-up, humble, respectful. I invite him in and offer a cup of tea. We talk quietly, not about the scandal, but about what happens after noise fades. I tell him, some stories end with silence, and that silence carries footprints if you listen. He nods, and I think, that's exactly why I stayed. By afternoon, I gather envelopes for scholarship checks, small awards but mighty in their reach. I seal each with a stamp, each a quiet echo of dignity. In the late afternoon light, I teach a piano lesson to a woman in her 60s. She jokes she's there just to prove she can still learn. By the end, her hands form chords so clear they sound like applause. Not for me, but for the music that lived inside her all along. I write a note at the bottom of my journal. No epilogue needed when the echoes continue. I close the book. At dusk, I walk back to the porch. The sky blooms with purple, silver, and eyelashes of cloud. I breathe in the cool air and let the silence be a benediction. Because I know now, the real legacy isn't carved in headlines. It lives in people remembering what you taught them. Not saying it, you in who you were and who stood here. In this quiet ending, I am not wrote out of the story. I am still walking its pages. Her silence was never a weakness, it was power, held with grace. And in the end, it spoke louder than any insult ever could. If her story moved you, imagine how many voices like hers go unheard every day. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories for more powerful, untold moments of quiet strength, justice served, and dignity that never fades. Because some truths deserve to be remembered and honored. See you in the next story.